Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. The name of this sermon is Thanks for Neither and Give Me Both. In this passage, Paul has some amazing things happened. And you would say, well, yeah, I'd like that. You get to go to heaven and see amazing things. Who wouldn't want that? But then you look at it and say, he didn't get to talk about it. He's saying 14 years ago, this is the first the Corinthians had heard about it. Because he didn't get to talk about it. And then he got a thorn in the flesh. So you would want neither one of those. But then you say, yeah, give me both. Because through that weakness, he got to do all these amazing things that we read about all through the New Testament. You may remember the cartoon in the newspaper called Little Orphan Annie. Little Orphan Annie was this little girl who was red hair and cute as a button, who was an orphan. And in the musical, she sings a song called The Hard Knocks Life. And that was Paul's life. He had a life full of hard knocks. But he was still able to do all these things. He had, there's a plan B and a plan A. This is a story about a plan B car. I was watching a video of Jay Leno's garage. And Jay Leno has all these cars that he owns. And he brings out a car and he tells you about it and he explains it. And this particular car was a 66 Corvair with a turbo. Great car. But when he bought it, it was really a Plan B car because it didn't work very good. It was okay, but it wasn't like that. But he wanted a Plan A car. He said that it had the wrong turbo on it, and there was a wiring ground problem that it would work and then it wouldn't work and it would kill the battery and stuff like that. And so there was a bunch of other things, and he fixed them all. And he put the right year turbo on it, and he fixed the ground, and that was a Plan A car. It was as good or better than it was when from the factory. It was a pleasure to drive. You see, the thing is that for most people, they buy the car and they struggle with, well, it's not perfect, but it gets me where I want to go, and it's nice enough, and they accepted a Plan B car. Well, Paul said he had a Plan B life. But he managed to be able to function and do a lot of things because God was helping him. And it was still hard and complicated and full of heartache. But he knew a Plan A life was coming. He'd seen it. He'd gone to heaven. He'd seen the Plan A life. We're all, as Christians, guaranteed a Plan A life. There's another woman tell you a story about. Her name is Charlotte Elliot, and she had a Plan B life. She had a handicap from a small child, and she was not able to get out because of this handicap. She spent most of the time in bed, and she was angry about it. And when she was 33, a pastor came to her to comfort her, to talk to her, and she gave him a whole list of why she was mad at God. And the pastor listened and was sympathetic, but he said, you have to understand that God knows everything about you, and he has allowed this, and through this weakness, he can still work through you. He can still do something. Well, she was not happy. He was saying, his grace is sufficient for you. Well, that's not what she wanted to hear. But she couldn't get those words out of her heart and her head, and eventually she became a Christian. And every year, the pastor who came to visit her sent her a letter saying, please continue in your... it was kind of a yearly keep up the good work thing. One of the things that she resented or was sad about was that her Her brother, who was a pastor, was doing all these things, and she couldn't get out of the house to serve God at all. She was trapped in the house most of the time, unless people came and got her. And on the 14th anniversary, when she got that letter, she wrote this song. This was in 1822, so it was a Plan B life. There was no fixing it. There was no automatic door openers and no ramps and no electric wheelchairs. She wrote this song. Just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. She wrote that. And the pastor, her brother, was talking about his life and all the things he'd done. And he said, all I've done cannot compare to this one song that she wrote. Even with a Plan B life, people still sing that song and still are touched and recognize that whatever happens, God is still there. God is still looking after us. Well, let's look at Paul's Plan B life. Number one is the last boast. Not the last post, the last boast. He says, boasting is unnecessary, though it's not profitable, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I don't know, or out of the body I don't know, God knows, such a man was caught up to the third heaven. I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body I don't know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which a man is not permitted to speak. Now, one of the things that separated regular, average missionaries of Paul's time and the top tier, the best ones, was their visions and revelations from God. If they could tell a good story of all these revelations they had, well, they would be top tier. And I looked up the revelations of Paul, and there was a list of Acts this, Acts that, all these that we could read. But I'll just tell you one. Do you remember Paul had a vision, and a man from Macedonia said, come and teach us. So even though Paul had other visions, and they're listed, he didn't mention any of them. And here's another one in Galatians 2:2. It says, it was because of a revelation that I went up and I submitted to them the gospel which I've been preaching among the Gentiles. That's a revelation that he had from God. And there's more of those revelations, and I could list them too. And you think to yourself, well, I don't doubt that Paul had these visions and revelations. I'm not questioning, well, I wonder if he just made that up. We know he did them because he's trustworthy because of the things he did and said. The problem that he was identifying was that these other people that forced him to brag to compete with them, the question was, did they really have these visions? See, it all comes down to being trustworthy or to be able to tell a good story. I told you a couple years ago this story of a man who had this amazing testimony. He had done all these awful things, and then he'd become part of the Church of Satan, and he became a high priest of the Church of Satan, and he became saved. God saved him. And he traveled around from churches to church and gave his testimony, and they give him a love offering, and the money was just pouring in. And then somebody said, well, let me see. You're 24 and you did all these things. Not possible. I should check on this. You can't have joined the church and been the high priest of the church in 9 months. That doesn't happen. And we checked, and of course, his story all fell apart. Now, Paul was also allowing these people to think logically. Okay, this guy, he's come and he's told me all these revelations and all these visions, and let me think about that. Let me do it the sniff test. Let me see if that's really the case. Did those things really happen to them? I was listening to something on the radio while it's actually recorded. This guy was talking about how in the 1800s the steam engine came and all these machines to reproduce, all sorts of great science was happening, but nothing was happening in medicine. Now, in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, you could get medicine. It was like Dr. Womble's elixir of life, or something like that. I collected bottles when I was younger, and I've got some of those amazing things, medicine. And so they had a bottle of it, and some scientists said, let's test this elixir of life and see if it will really cure cancer and grow your hair back and make you stronger and younger and fitter. It had two poisons, nightshade and arsenic, and it had mercury and lead in it. And all that list of things that it did, it really wouldn't. And if you took too much of it, you just were likely to die. Well, the same was true with these, what Paul was saying about these false teachers. These false revelations, if they didn't come from God, where did they come from? They came from the devil. In Galatians 1:6, it says, I am amazed that you were so quickly desert him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another, only those are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, as I say again now, if any man is preaching you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. Paul is saying that these visions and revelations they're bragging on support a different gospel than the one you received. And if that's the case, don't accept it. Now, Paul in his previous, if you turn back to chapter 11, you go through a list of all these things. He had been whipped 4 times, he'd been shipwrecked 3 times. He made a list of these things. But the funny thing is, he didn't make a list of visions. I had 18 visions. I had 46 revelations. He didn't say that. He just listed one vision. And it was a big one. He'd been taken up to heaven and saw things and words that he was not allowed to speak. Words he couldn't say. He said they were inexpressible, which seems to sound like he couldn't speak them even if he had permission. The other possibility is they were so perfect that human lips of a sinful body couldn't actually make those sounds, make them come out of your mouth. You remember Moses wasn't allowed to see the face of God because it would kill him. In the same way, maybe these words were of such greatness and amazement that he wouldn't have been allowed to say them. Impossible. Well, there's 2 possible things here. Is that you think about, well, if you can't say them, if you're not able, the words won't come out, that's okay. That's one thing. It's sad. But the worst would be if you could say them, but you weren't given permission. And you would say to somebody, I see that you're sad. I see that you need help. Let me give you a word of encouragement. And, oh, sorry, I can't say those words. They would be perfect. They would help you immensely, but I can't say them. How sad would that be? I know lots of people wouldn't, I said that, I wasn't supposed to, I'm sorry, I blurted that out. And no, 14 years he carried this. He wasn't able to say it. Paul was saying, I know a man, and which is strange, right? It was him. When he says, I know a man, whether in body or part of the body, it was almost as if he was saying, I can't take credit for this. I'm trying to say it, but not say it. I'm trying not to take credit, because think of this as if you climb Mount Everest, and you could brag that I climbed Mount Everest and I saw this great view from the top of Mount Everest. And not only do very few people have the ability and the skill and the strength to climb Mount Everest, most people who climb end up seeing clouds. It was a clear day, and so I can brag about what I saw. But he says, I was caught up into heaven. He didn't do anything. He couldn't brag that he'd gone. It was impossible. Somebody had done it for him. And he was even speaking of it, with greatest reservations. I don't really want to say this. Well, number 2, what you see is what you get. In verse 5 it says, on behalf of such a man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except in regard to my weakness. For if I do wish to boast, I will not be foolish, for I will be speaking the truth. But I refrain from this, so that no one will credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me. Now, it's one of those things that happen all the time, is that all through history, people like to be honored. And it's proper to honor people. The woman that invented insulin, it's proper to honor her. That's a great thing, right? And our society has come up with ways to honor people. If you're a general in the army, you put General Bob whatever. You can put that in front of your name. As long as you're a general, you can be General Eisenhower. And if you go to university, you can put a whatever degrees after your name. General Eisenhower, MD, or General Eisenhower, whatever. And if you're a member of Parliament, you could put MP, or you could put MLA. You're allowed to put those things after your name, and you can do all those. Well, I've got a question for you. If you're coming to hear a speech, and there's an uneducated man, but man, can he speak. Has he ever got the right kind of voice, and can he ever say the right words, and you're on your edge of your seat? Would you prefer to hear him, or would you prefer to hear somebody with an alphabet after the name that can't put a sentence together? And you're just going, oh no, I wish he would finish. It's been 100 years at the 5-minute mark. Well, it's not that simple. Because you'd probably pick the guy that could speak well, but the problem is, maybe that guy's a charlatan. And in spite of the fact that what he can hold the crowd's attention, he's telling lies. To Paul's point, don't just go for the one who speaks well, or for the one who's got the proper credentials. I had visions, I had revelations. This is what gives me the right to speak. He says in verse 6, credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me. He was saying, look, I came to you. You need to credit me with what you've seen and heard me do. Don't look at my resume. Look at what I've done. Number 3, a messenger from Satan. Verse 7 says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. More gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ will dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weakness, and insults, and distresses, and persecutions, and difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I am strong. When you look at verse 7, that talks about surpassing greatness, that and a thorn in the flesh, you ask the question, that there's a question that comes to my mind. Okay, Paul had this amazing vision. Okay, we believe him, we trust him. And because of this amazing vision, Paul would have got a head 2 sizes too big, and so God gave him a thorn in the flesh. Okay, we're following that. But he's boasting because he's competing with these other great Christians that have come to, and you say to yourself, well, why haven't they got a thorn in the flesh? Why aren't I hearing that about them? Well, there's 2 possibilities. One is that they're so amazing a person that humility would just ooze out of them. And that there would be no chance of them, even if they got to see heaven, that their head would get big. Well, it seems strange, right? If these others didn't get a thorn in the flesh, and you looked at them and you said, no, I know them. I've seen them. They've only been here 2 weeks, and I know that pride is a problem for them. So what's the matter? There's got to be something wrong. See, Paul is letting the church in Corinth think the same thoughts that I just spoke. Well, what about that? How come they don't have a thorn in the flesh? Now, there's some argument as to what the thorn is. Some people said it was migraine headaches or some debilitating sickness that some days he could function and other days he was out of it. And other people said it was a person that was after him and hounded him at every turn. Every time he tried to do something, there was that guy behind him pointing the finger and yelling his name. Well, we don't know which it is, but God allowed it to keep on bothering him, to keep him from exalting himself. And I thought to myself, if Paul is this great guy, this great missionary, and he needs a thorn in the flesh, what about us? I was thinking he'd had visions and healed people, and that didn't put him over the edge. But he had this vision from 14 years. See, the vision was 14 years ago. So I said, well, when does the Bible say that 2 Corinthians was written? And you go back 14 years, what was he doing at that time? Well, it turns out that was the start of his first missionary journey. So all those things that we read about, the healings and the visions and everything, started after he had this first vision and he was working with a thorn in the flesh. And God told him no after he asked 3 times and said, my grace is sufficient for you. See, he came to realize that he could do all these things, all these accomplishments, but they weren't his accomplishments. They were Jesus' accomplishments through him. And he wasn't strong. And I don't know if you know this, but strong people who have never had to be laid aside, it's excruciatingly painful for them to have to admit that they need help. And let me tell you this story. I built a nativity scene at the church, and it was like 300 pounds of wood. And I built the sides and the top and the figures in it, and I was taking it down. It was after Christmas, and there was people in the church who could come out and help me hold it, and I take it apart, and we could carry it away. And I said, no, I can do this myself. I can do this myself. So here I am. I'm taking out the last screw, And I know that I got to jump out of the way like this, or it's going to hit me. And I'm saying to myself, look, I should be not so proud, and I go get help. And anyway, it came down and it hit me right here. And I've got, the Studebaker logo, the little stylized S. There's one in my leg right there. I was too proud to go get help. And Paul was past that all. He knew that there was nothing he did. There was nothing he had done on his own. It was all God doing it for him. Verse 10, when we read, I'm well content with weakness and insults and distresses and persecution and difficulty. That's his resume. That's, instead of having it Sir Paul, having a knighthood and having all those names and letters after his name, that's his resume. Weakness. And that's why he was struggling to brag, because he recognized that for the past 14 years, the only thing he could brag about was weakness. And so, because of that, God had the upper hand. God could do a whole lot of things through him, because he says, for when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So, what can we say with this? What's the answer? What's the application? And I thought to myself, what difference did it make to Paul that other pastors came and preached in his church? And what difference does it make if why would he say no, it can only be Silas or Timothy or Apollos? These are the ones I've said are okay. That wasn't it at all. It wasn't his having to have the church under his thumb. It was the fact that they were, all these visions and revelations were wrong. They were preaching a different gospel. You see, they were telling great stories of revelations from the Holy Spirit, and they weren't saying anything bad about Paul. So they were saying, look, Paul had brought you this much, but the whole thing is this big, and he only brought you this much, and we're telling you the rest. We're giving you the rest of the story. We're changing, but it wasn't true. You know what Paul said in Galatians? If anybody brings you a different gospel, see, they were just peddling lies that the devil had used since Adam and Eve. There's one, I won't go into all these different, there's Gnosticism, but there's one of them was called secret knowledge. There's secret knowledge. If I let you hear this, if I tell you this, you won't be just a regular Christian. You will be so amazing. And let me share this secret knowledge with you. There's a modern equivalent to that heresy. There's people that write books that explain to you how that if you take the fifth word in the sentence, or the ninth word in the sentence and the fifth letter, and you add those letters together, it'll tell you something that's amazing. And you know what? It's true. And you think, oh, wow. But somebody did something. You know how I said about the guy that told the great story and people looked it up? Well, the truth is that even though that you can do that with the Bible, you can do that with Shakespeare's Hamlet, and you can do it with the telephone book, and you can do it with the Sears catalog. It's just something you can do. If you come up with a formula to pick numbers and letters. So it really didn't, you see, it's heresy. And Paul was very clear. He said in Galatians 6-9, that if anyone comes to you, even us, or an angel from heaven comes and speaking and preaching a different gospel, send them away. That's false. Martin Luther, you know the Lutherans, they were named after him. Martin Luther was an amazing man, and he told lots of good things, but in the end of his life, he said some stuff that you went to say, oh dear. And part of it was he was old, and he was he was suffering from lead poisoning. At that time, everybody ate from pewter dishes, and pewter was half lead, and so the spoon had lead on it, the bowl had lead on it, the cup had lead in it. You had lead poisoning. He was speaking from, you have to ignore what he said. It was heresy, but it wasn't his fault. He had dementia or worse. Well, we have famous Christian leaders that are preaching heresy too. They want to let people who have a particular sin they want to keep, they want to make them feel these people want to be Christians, but they want to keep this sin. And we want to make them feel okay. Well, Jesus says, come as you are, and I'll wash you white as snow. Their heresy that Paul was preaching against, and the heresy that some pastors are saying, is come as you are, stay as you are. Just give God what you want, and he'll be happy with that. If your life is a house, invite him in, but put little tags on doors you don't want him to be part of. This is the door where I watch TV that shows are not good. God, you can't come in here. Well, that all sounds great. You get all the advantages of the gospel, of being a Christian, with no chance of God requiring from you anything too difficult. It sounds good, but it's a false gospel. You just have to read these words that say, Paul, that wonderful man who was used greatly by God, who you would think would be God's favorite, and he would not make it. No, he gave him a thorn in the flesh. And he said, I'm content with weaknesses and insults and distresses and persecution and difficulties. God doesn't say, you become a Christian and I'll take away all those things from you. That's not true. It's a false gospel. Paul had this wonderful vision 14 years ago. 14 years back. And who wouldn't say yes to a short visit to heaven? On your worst day, on the hardest day, you could say, yes, I'm having an awful day, but I know that heaven is true. I've been there, I've seen it, I know it's true. Would be great, right? The problem was Paul got something else that he couldn't refuse. A thorn in the flesh. And it stayed, and God refused to remove it. He told him that his grace was sufficient. And Paul, you're going to work better in weakness. See, all those wonderful things we read about that Paul did, he did in weakness. All the preaching and the whippings and all those things, and half of the books in the Bible all came from Paul's weakness. Now, there's two things that we can take away from this passage. The first is, get the gospel right and keep it right, and don't let anybody convince you that oh, I had this revelation, I had this. This is the new, more sanitized, better version of the gospel that doesn't hurt anybody's feelings. Don't accept that. Not even if they're a great speaker and they have a wonderful presence on the stage. Don't accept that. Most of it's a false gospel because they're either taking away something from the gospel or adding to it. The second is, don't be afraid of weakness. It's what carried Paul through shipwrecks and whippings and the writing of all these books we're reading. Don't be afraid to say, I can't do this. But if I give my heart and put my pride out of the way, that Jesus can do it through me. He can carry me along for the most amazing ride in my life. See, Jesus is okay if you only have a plan B life. That's all Paul had. And you saw the amazing things he did. We just sang, and I just read, just as I am. She had a plan B life. But God used her. 200 years ago, we still sing that song. Let's pray. Lord Jesus,